When it comes to hypervisors like Proxmox VE, saving power isn't usually the priority, but when you're running virtual machines on a home server and your electricity costs are high, every watt needs to be accounted for. Now, I bought a Minisforum MS-01 to lower my energy costs, but even with a mini PC like this, there's more energy you could be saving if you make some adjustments. So, what software can you use, and what BIOS settings can you apply to reduce your energy bill? Well, if that's something that you're interested in finding out, then stick around and watch this video, because that's what we'll be going over. At the time of recording, I've updated the BIOS on this computer to version 1.27, and we'll be making changes in the BIOS which I believe requires this version. Unfortunately, I don't have another computer to compare this one against, and after reading the release notes, I have to make this assumption. So, if your computer is using an older BIOS, and you find some options I'm showing are missing from your computer, then you'll need to upgrade your BIOS.
Danger, Will Robinson, danger. Danger, Will Robinson, danger.
Now, before we get started, I have to put out some warnings. Enabling power saving features can result in things no longer working. A device or attachment might go to sleep, for instance, and just not wake up. In addition, things may no longer run as quickly as before, and you might decide that the latency is just too high to be worth it. But I'm prioritizing power savings over performance to reduce my energy bill. More importantly though, before you make any changes like this, make sure you've got full control of the computer in case something goes wrong. For instance, the operating system could lock up after changes are applied, or it won't reboot cleanly. In that state, you'll no longer be able to get access to it through SSH or the GUI, for instance. So, make sure you can always access the console and the BIOS no matter what state the computer is in. And while I use a KVM and I can control the power supply using a smart switch, sometimes physical access will still be necessary. Now, when it comes to saving power in Linux, chances are you've probably heard of Powertop. Now, I've been using that on other computers and it does work fine, but just doesn't play well with this MS-01 for some strange reason, or at least when I've got it running Proxmox VE here. So I've been trying that to save power. So I'd installed it, ran it with the auto tune setting, but then when I ran Powertop to have a look around, initially I could tab through the pages, but then the session locked up and I just couldn't get out. I couldn't exit the actual program. So I jumped over to the summary tab, back to the shell session, tried Powertop again, same result. So there's clearly something going wrong here. And then all of a sudden I was starting to get timeout warnings. I couldn't get console access into any of my virtual machines anymore. So I thought, well, in that case, I'll just reboot the computer. I mean, fortunately with Powertop, when you run that auto tune option, the settings are lost on the reboot. So I tried that, but the computer just stuck. It wouldn't do a clean reboot. So I had to physically turn the computer off, then back on again. So once it was back up and running, I then tried to get access to the computer through an SSH session and see if that would make any difference. So again, ran Powertop with the auto tune options, but again, when I ran Powertop to go through the actual pages, no, I got so far and then all of a sudden it just locked up. So I couldn't get out, so I had to actually close the terminal session down. And then when I went back into the actual Debian operating system on Proxmox VE here, I couldn't actually remove the actual SSH session. I couldn't get access to the computer through SSH again. I couldn't restart the SSHD service. So I was stuck again with a problem of something's gone wrong. So I ended up having to try to reboot the computer. Again, wouldn't get a clean reboot, so I had to physically turn it off and then back on again. So in that case, I decided to try a different approach. And so what I've got installed on here now is TLP, or what I think is called ThinkPad Linux Power. So these are geared more towards sort of like laptops where you're trying to save power when you're on battery basically, but I've got these running 24/7 and I just want to save as much power as I possibly can. So the first thing you'd have to do is to actually install TLP. So we'll do apt update just to make sure that the package information is up to date. And then there's two packages we want to install, or make sure they get installed. So that's TLP and then TLP-RDW. It will install other things, but I've just got that -y option there just to save me answering the prompt. Now, as you can see, I've already got it installed, but once that's installed, you'll want to check the actual service status, because that's what you'll have as an actual service that's running. So we're using systemctl status, then tlp.service. As you can see, it's enabled and the service is active, so that's good to see. What we can also do is then get a bit more feedback by running this command, tlp-stat, then -s. What's particularly interesting is this part here, because when I first installed it, I didn't have anything against last run. What I found a way to resolve that was just to force it to basically restart the service. So systemctl restart tlp.service, and that kind of kicked it into play basically. Then we had TLP actually up and running. Now, what we've got here is a service that's running, and it comes with a lot of default settings basically, and you can check what the configuration settings are by running tlp-stat then -c, and it comes back and it tells you about all of these settings, and you'll see whether they're on the defaults or whether they've been actually edited or not. So unlike say Powertop, you don't have to go in and edit individual files. There's just one configuration file, so it does make life a bit easier here. So we'll use a nano here to edit tlp.conf in the /etc folder. And the good thing is you get this configuration file, which is very, very detailed, very informative. I mean, it gives you the settings, everything's commented out by default, but it also tells you what the default settings are as well, which is extremely useful. Now, rather than me going through every single line and uncommenting things, what I ended up doing is just going right to the end of the file, and I put in all of these settings here. Now, if you want to get a better view of what these settings are, and you just want to copy and paste them, you can go and have a look at the blog that I've got for this video, and I'll leave a link to it in the video. But basically, these are the settings that I've changed. Feel free to have a look around the actual config file and change other things. But the key things are the governor. By default, with Proxmox VE, you've got a governor that's running the CPU here, and it's running basically the CPU at full pelt. It runs in performance mode. And that's not really good in like a home environment where you're trying to save power. Now, this particular processor, it's only got two options, either performance or power save, and that's what I've gone for here, power save. I want to save power, so I've also got a performance policy set to power. Then we've got our other settings lowered down. The only other ones I'll point out in particular, well, having said that, I mean, I've got some of these where I've actually got settings for on AC as well as on battery. That's just for the sake of completeness, to be honest. You don't really need those because it's not a computer that's running on battery, but I've just put them in because I want to just keep everything for the sake of completeness here. But one thing I will point out is these options at the bottom here, which is basically disable Bluetooth. So this computer has got a Wi-Fi module which also supports Bluetooth. Now, I can disable the Wi-Fi through the BIOS, but I can't disable Bluetooth for some reason. So for that reason, I've also got TLP actually disabling the Bluetooth for me. That should, in theory, save me a bit of power. I mean, it's not actually being used, so whatever power I can save out on this computer, the better, really. But essentially, these are the settings that I've gone with. I mean, I'm not overly familiar with TLP. You can go through the actual config file and get a vague idea, but in the end, I ended up asking Gemini for feedback, what it suggested, and this is basically what it came up with after a lot of trial and error that we went through. This is what we settled on. So basically, you just want to copy and paste all those lines in at the end, and then you've got your configuration file. Now, we've got options. You can reboot the computer and then it'll actually go through the process because it's a service and it'll apply those settings. There is also a command you can run, TLP start. Now, again, it might be my specific computer. I don't have another MS-01 to test against, but when I run that command, it supposedly goes through the process of applying those settings. But what I found is it locks the computer up similar to what Powertop did. And that was it. This causes a whole heap of problems because I've got to then physically turn the computer off and back on again. So for that reason, if ever I change these settings, for me it means rebooting the computer. It's up to you whether you want to try that command or whether you just want to play it safe like I'm doing and just reboot the computer. But either way, we need these settings to take effect, and they're the two methods I know of doing it. So for me, if we run the config check here, you can see how those settings are already applied anyway, so I don't need to do anything further. But once you've actually made those changes and they're actually applied, you should see you actually start to save some power. Now, however you've actually applied those settings, you'll probably want to just double check that they're actually taking effect. One way to do that is to run a command which is TLP-stat, and then the option is -p. And then what we're particularly interested in is this line here, which is telling us that the actual governor is set to power save. But there's also this line here, which is telling us that the energy performance preference is set to power. Those settings alone are probably where most of the energy performance savings are going to come from. So it always pays to double check those are set correctly. Now, to really save power on this computer, we need to make some changes in the BIOS because by default, power saving is disabled. So to get into the BIOS, you either need to start the computer up from cold or reboot it. Either way, when you see that Minisforum logo, you start to press the delete key and then it takes you into the BIOS here. So we'll click on Setup, and I'm just going to scroll right to the top here because I just want to re-emphasize I'm on version 1.27. So this is the latest version at the time of recording, and I think, but I'm not 100% sure, that some of the features I'll show you are only available with this version. So if you go through this process of trying to make changes that I show you and you don't see those options available, it's probably because your BIOS needs to be updated. In any case, I'm going to click on Advanced, then on CPU Configuration. Now what I've done is I've changed boot performance mode from turbo performance to max non-turbo performance, and I've changed turbo mode from enabled to disabled. In other words, I want to save power. By disabling that ability to boost to the higher clock speed, it means the CPU isn't going to get as hot. It's also going to be saving power as well, which is my main goal. Now, most of the virtual machines I run, they tend to be headless, so I haven't noticed any issue with those of disabling this. But even with the actual virtual machines that have got a desktop on them, I haven't noticed any impact to them either. So this to me seemed a lot of sense. I already know it drops the CPU temperatures because in my initial testing, when I was in the BIOS, the temperature was somewhere in the 50 degrees C range upwards. When I actually disabled turbo mode, it was saving something like 10 degrees C. That's how much lower the actual temperature dropped by. So yeah, less temperature means there's less need to spin up the actual fans at a high speed, so less power draw. If you then go back to Advanced and then on board device settings, I've disabled the audio, so this is the onboard audio because I don't need it. May not save that much power. Maybe it only actually draws power when there's a cable plugged in, but there's no harm disabling it if I'm not using it. Then if we scroll down, we've got an option SA PCIe port. Select that. So these two settings apply to the leftmost NVMe, so that's the fastest one you get, the PCIe 4x4 one. Now I don't know why, but that's grayed out, but at least what we can do is enable power savings for that NVMe drive. Now, to be fair, NVMe's do tend to be power efficient anyway, but rather than the default option of disabled, I've set it to L0SL1. The wording here is a bit deceptive because I'm not seeing an auto option, so I'm thinking that's the nearest, because that's, you can either have L0S or L1. So I'm assuming that one's the equivalent of the auto option, where it's going to try and find the best power saving option while it's running. We've then got 3 settings here for the PCIe slot. The one to enable power savings disabled, like it is up here for the NVMe. Now I don't know whether that's maybe like a placeholder, maybe that, like that one is potentially for like a future upgrade, but it just means I can't enable power saving here. Maybe on the other hand it needs an actual card plugging in. I just don't know. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave this enabled anyway. Reason being is that gives me a baseline with at least that option enabled. So if somewhere down the line I decide to actually plug in a PCIe card, I know how much power is just specifically due to actually plugging the card in versus also enabling the option for that to work. The PCIe speed, I've just left it on auto because otherwise you're fixing it at a set speed. Then what we've got is 2 options for the 10 gig cards. Now, I'm not seeing individual settings, so this must apply to both of those 2 10 gig slots. All you can do here is just enable or disable them. Now, I'm not wanting to disable these because I use them, so I've just left it on enabled. And I can't turn off individual ones, so there's not a great deal I can do here. And that option there is disabled. Again, it's like these, that I don't know whether these things are just like placeholders for an upgrade. But unfortunately, I can't enable some sort of power saving for the 10 gig NICs. Now, if you don't use these, by all means turn them off and see if it saves you some power. We'll go back to advanced, then to onboard device settings. Now this time we'll go to PCH PCIe port. So here we've got one of the 2.5 gig network cards. I'm using them, so I'm leaving it enabled, but at least I can set the power option here. Now, interesting enough, this one does have an auto option, so I've set it from disabled to auto. So in theory, it should be saving me some power on the 2.5 gig card. So that's just, from what I understand, this is the normal 2.5 gig card that you get, because there's 2 2.5 gig slots in there. We've then got 2 settings for the middle NVMe slot. So this is the one that runs at PCIe 3x4. I'm using that, so I've left it enabled. Again, potentially you could save power by disabling it. Since I'm using it, I've changed the power management from disabled to auto. Again, NVMe cards tend to be power efficient, but any option to save power is good there for me. So that's why I'd rather have that on. We then get to the rightmost NVMe slot. Now that's PCIe 3x2. I don't expect to use that, so on the off chance it's going to save me power, I've disabled it. But just for the sake of continuity, I've set the power management to auto. I mean, you never know. Maybe I might use it. I mean, I find it highly unlikely given that sort of speed, but I'll just like everything set to auto, just on the off chance. Then lower down, we've got 2 settings for the other 2.5 gig slot, which as far as I'm aware, this is the one that supports vPro. So for me, that's been left as enabled, and I've changed this for the power management from disabled to auto. Again, there is the potential maybe to save power by disabling that. I'm not really sure if it only draws power if a cable's plugged in or not, but I suppose there's no harm disabling it if you're not going to use it at all. And then that brings us to the Wi-Fi. Now, this is a Wi-Fi module that could support both Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. Now, I'm not seeing a Bluetooth option, like I mentioned when I was covering TLP. Only an option to disable Wi-Fi, so I don't need it. So for that reason, on the off chance it saves me power, I'm disabling it. But again, just for that continuity, I've set the power management to auto. So in theory, that should be saving me some power, because I've got no plans for using Wi-Fi when I've got 10 gig network cards and 2.5 gig cards anyway. I just don't see the point. But unlike some computer systems I've come across, disabling Wi-Fi on this doesn't also disable Bluetooth, at least not as far as I can see. So that's why I had to also disable it in TLP later on. But either way, this has enabled our power management for the NVMe drives as well as some of the actual network cards as well. So if I come back to the onboard device settings and scroll further down, go right at the bottom here, there's an option here which is SAGV, System Agent Geyserville, I think it is. Now by default that's disabled and I've set it to enabled. Now the reason I've done that is I was going through a lot of trial and error with TLP and BIOS settings, so there was a lot of conversations between me and Gemini trying to find out what could save power, and it actually suggested I enable this feature. Now I didn't know what this was at all, so it pointed out to me, if we go to CPU configuration here, there's a Intel speed step. Apparently this Geyserville is a precursor to that. I'd never heard of it, but it suggested enable it. I mean, I did query it. It's like, well, if that's the newer, greater version, why have this on at all? And it says, well, as long as it's enabled, it has the potential to still save even more power, as long as it doesn't cause any issues. You don't see your computer crash, for example. I mean, I've been running it for quite a while. I've never had any issues, so I'm just leaving it enabled. So potentially that could be saving me power, but feel free to experiment with that. So yeah, by default it's disabled, so for me there's been no harm enabling it. If we come back to advanced, then go to ACPI settings, I've also disabled wake up on LAN. By default that's actually enabled. Now that only really applies, as far as I'm aware, when the computer's in sleep mode. In other words, it's sitting there waiting, listening for a magic packet that it can then use to trigger the operating system to boot back up. The only drawback is, in that case, it's then actually, it's not in as deep a sleep as it could be, so it's drawing more power. Now granted, this computer is going to be running 24/7 most of the time, but I prefer to turn this off just on the off chance. Any opportunity to save power is good in my book, so I've disabled it. I don't use Wake on LAN anymore. I think there was a video I was showing quite some time ago, and as somebody pointed out in comments, to be honest, this is the better option. And that's what I actually moved on to as well, which is that I use smart switches on my computers, and they can control the power supply to the computer itself. They will draw a bit more power, but they're also being used for monitoring the power usage anyway. But the idea is that I will gracefully shut down the computer. It's still drawing power, so that I'll then use the actual smart switch to just completely remove power to the computer. Then what will happen is, if I want to restore the computer and I want to get it back up and running, I've got this setting, restore on AC power loss, and then what will happen is, as soon as I turn the actual switch back on again, power supply to the computer, and it'll boot straight up again because of this setting. But this is also useful if there's a power cut. It be a case of there's a power cut, there's no power to the computer. Once power is restored, it'll automatically power it back on again. So it has some useful uses here. I mean, I think back in the days this probably made sense. The downside, and the big downside for me, was that you can't use Wake on LAN to power a computer up from cold. At least I've never been able to. What I found is that you would turn the computer on at the wall, but it just wouldn't respond to a Wake on LAN packet. I would have to turn the computer on and then power it back off, so it goes into that sleep mode, and then it'll respond to Wake on LAN. So for that reason I've stopped using that, and that's why I prefer this instead. But they're all the settings that I've made. Once you've actually done those, you'll want to go to save and exit, and then save changes and reset. One thing I'll say is be prepared. As far as I'm aware, I think the computer retrains itself because of those changes, and it takes a while. I mean, it's nail biting stuff. Basically, you've rebooted the computer and you're sitting there waiting and waiting. You start tapping your fingers and you're thinking, is this thing going to come back up again? And you're seriously wondering, have I broke it? But fortunately, at least in my case anyway, it did come back up eventually. But it's kind of nerve-wracking because you're just seeing nothing. There's no sign of anything. But eventually it does come back up, which is a good thing. And then Proxmox just booted up. And the really interesting thing, though, was there's a combination of those TLP settings and this BIOS changes that I've done here, the computer dropped from about 22 watts to 15 watts once Proxmox VE was up and had settled. So no virtual machines running. That's a saving of 7 watts. That's a big difference. 7 watts compared to 22 watts. That's a massive saving. Interestingly enough, I then started some virtual machines up. I mean, not a great deal. And they went over the 20 watt power range while they were spinning up, and I was interacting with like the desktop one, for example. Then I exited out of all the sessions and it was down to 16 watts. It's like, wow, that's a big power saving, 16 watts, while those virtual machines are running. Now, one thing I will point out though is that at this moment in time, there's a bit of it's like a heat dome, I think it's called, over Europe and the UK. And yeah, now this is running hotter, shall we say, and I think the fans are running faster as well. So at the moment it's doing about 17, maybe 19 watts at times. All of a sudden, just one day it went from 16 watts and buff shoot was up to about 19 watts. And that's just because it's a lot hotter where this computer is at the moment. But wow, to see the way that's a big saving on power. Even at first glance, I can see these changes are going to save me a lot of power. Before I started using TLP or mid BIOS changes, the computer was pulling anywhere from 25 watts to 28 watts whilst it was idling overnight. Now it's at about 16 watts, which is a saving of 9 watts, so a drop of 36%. And to me that's great, as this computer is using 10 gig Ethernet. Now, there is a trade-off, mind, because I've noticed a desktop VM now experiences lag. The web browser, for instance, it takes longer to load pages, but it's tolerable. The only way to resolve this is to revert the CPU governor back to performance, but much of the power savings would then be lost. So given that replacing just one enterprise server, which idles at about 70 watts, could save me over 1 kilowatt each day, it's worth it. Now, I'll be doing more longer term testing on this computer, but what experiences have you had with the MS-01? Let me know in the comments below. Now, if you find this video to be useful, then do consider subscribing to the channel, as that would really mean a lot to me. But it's also a good indicator to let me know how videos like this are helpful to people such as yourselves that are watching. In which case, thank you. On the other hand, if you're not ready for that level of commitment, then I'd really appreciate it if you could press the like button, because that way that'll help to get the video out to other people that might find it useful as well.